The little girl followed the little pony one morning. What she found in the canyon changed everything. Red Rock, Wyoming Territory, early spring of 1883. The frost had not yet lifted from the ground, and the sun was just a pale smear behind the eastern hills. Sarah Collins knelt in the thin grass by the south fence, hammer in hand, pressing a warped board back into place. Her gloves were worn at the fingertips, the nails cold in her pocket. Every post she repaired was another day. This fence might keep the animals where they belong. "Mama, the pony's running to the canyon." Sarah's head jerked up. She spotted Emily by the barn, her small hands pointing toward the far pasture. "Stay here, Emily, it's too dangerous," Sarah called out, her voice sharp with worry. "But I can catch him." Emily's words were small, hesitant, but before Sarah could say another thing, the little girl spun and darted off, her boots kicking up puffs of frost-bitten grass. "Emily!" Sarah dropped the hammer and ran, her skirt snagging on a low splinter of fence as she scrambled over the rise. Buttercup, their golden pony, was moving at an easy trot ahead of Emily, his tail swishing lazily. The rope from his halter trailed in the dirt, and he followed the narrow path toward the canyon. Sarah's chest tightened. That canyon was trouble. Steep drops, loose stones, and cracks in the earth deep enough to swallow a man. Her husband had told her once that a single misstep there could end a life. By the time she caught sight of Emily again, the child was already halfway down the trail into the canyon, her short legs quick and determined. Buttercup had vanished around a bend. "Emily, stop right now!" Sarah's voice echoed off the canyon walls, but the little girl didn't turn. When Sarah rounded the bend herself, she found Emily crouched in the dust, not looking at the pony at all. Buttercup stood a few paces away, head lowered, sniffing at something lying in the shadow of a rock outcrop. It was a man. He lay on his side, his coat torn at the shoulder, a dark stain spreading across the leather. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and there was a deep gash on his forehead. Nearby, the shredded remains of a saddle lay in the dirt, the stirrup leather sliced clean. Drops of blood led up the trail, mixed with the sharp gouges of hooves, as if there had been a struggle. Emily looked up. "Mama, he's hurt bad. He won't wake up." Sarah knelt quickly, brushing dust from his cheek. His skin was cold, but there was a pulse, faint, steady. His face, though streaked with blood, was strong-boned beneath the stubble. Whoever he was, he hadn't been here long. "We have to help him," Emily said, her voice small but certain. Sarah glanced around. No other rider. No sign of whoever had done this. The canyon was silent except for the distant call of a hawk. Emily tugged at the strap of her little canteen, the one she used when she chased Buttercup in the yard. She unscrewed it with both hands and tipped it toward the man's lips. "Emily, that's—" Sarah began, but stopped as she saw the water trickle into his mouth. His throat worked in a shallow swallow. "He's thirsty," Emily whispered, though Sarah could see her own lips were dry and cracked. Sarah took a slow breath, then slipped her shawl from her shoulders and draped it over the man, tucking it around his sides to hold in the meager warmth. The wind carried the smell of dust and sage, sharp in her nose. "Come on, sweetheart," she said quietly. "We're taking him home." Buttercup flicked his ears, as if understanding, and Sarah began to figure how to move an unconscious man out of a canyon with nothing but a rope, a pony, and the stubborn will that had kept her and Emily alive these past 2 years. The canyon wind cut sharp and cold as Sarah dropped to her knees beside Emily. The little girl was sitting in the dust, her tiny hand resting on the arm of a man sprawled half in shadow. He looked to be in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered under a weather-worn leather coat, now darkened with blood at the shoulder and across his temple. "Emily, step back," Sarah said quickly, her eyes sweeping over him. "He's hurt bad." Emily shook her head. He woke up for a second, then closed his eyes again. Sarah pressed 2 fingers to his neck. A pulse, weak but there. Her first instinct was to run for help, to fetch Sheriff Talbot or anyone from town who could deal with an unconscious stranger. She didn't know this man. He could be trouble. Then his eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment, his gaze met hers. There was no threat in it, only a raw, wordless plea. Something in that faint, desperate look made her pause. "All right," she muttered under her breath. "We're not leaving you here." She glanced up the slope they had come down. The path was narrow, scattered with loose shale. Getting him out would be hard, but leaving him meant he might not survive another hour. "Emily, get the rope from Buttercup's saddle," she instructed. The little girl scrambled to obey. Sarah looped the rope carefully under the man's arms, wincing as he groaned faintly. She anchored it to Buttercup's small but sturdy frame, then took the lead herself, pulling while the pony stepped forward. Inch by inch they dragged him up the slope, Sarah digging her heels into the dirt for leverage. Emily tugged alongside her with all the strength her small body could muster. By the time they reached the rim of the canyon, Sarah's arms burned, her breath sharp in her chest. Buttercup stood panting, ears flicking nervously. "Just a bit more," she told Emily, and together they managed to half-carry, half-drag the man toward the house. Inside, she cleared the table with one sweep of her arm and lowered him onto it. His head lolled to one side, a fresh streak of blood staining her sleeve. "Emily, bring the clean rags from the shelf," Sarah said, reaching for the basin. She poured water from the kettle, the steam curling into the cold room. With quick, practiced movements, she cleaned the wound at his temple, then tore a strip from an old sheet to bind it. The shoulder wound was deeper. She packed it with cloth and tied it tight. As she worked, her hand brushed against something under his coat. She reached in and drew out a small, worn leather pouch. The initials J.D. were pressed into the flap. Beneath it, tucked into an inner pocket, was an old silver badge, dulled with age, but still bearing the engraving of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. She stared at it for a moment. That badge marked a man of means, someone who owned cattle in large numbers, maybe hundreds of head. What was a man like that doing injured and alone in a canyon? The man stirred, his lips moving. Sarah leaned closer. "Named they. Took the herd. And my horse." The words were barely more than a breath before he slipped back into unconsciousness. Sarah straightened slowly, her mind working. Whoever this man was, trouble had found him. And now, whether she liked it or not, he was lying in her kitchen, and his trouble might not be far behind. The smell of wood smoke and strong coffee lingered in the small kitchen, weaving through the worn wooden beams and settling into the corners of the room like an old friend. Sarah was tending the stove when a low groan caught her attention. She turned just in time to see the stranger's eyelids flutter open, revealing eyes heavy with pain and confusion. His gaze slowly swept across the cramped space before resting on her. Then, as if drawn by some silent signal, it shifted to Emily, who sat cross-legged on the floor, gently brushing Buttercup's coat with a careful hand. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, scraped raw by thirst and exhaustion. "You're in my home," Sarah said calmly, wiping her hands on her apron, "near Red Rock, Wyoming." He shifted slightly, wincing as the movement tugged at the bandage wrapped around his shoulder. "I'm John Dawson," he managed. "I owned the Triple Ridge Ranch, about 30 miles east of here." Sarah's brow furrowed in surprise. "That's a long way from this canyon." John's jaw clenched with quiet frustration. "I was driving a small string of bloodstock into town when they came out of nowhere, masked men, armed to the teeth. Took the horses, the gear, everything. Left me for dead." Emily's wide eyes looked up at him curiously. "Bad men?" John's lips curled into a faint, weary smile, despite the pain etched across his face. "The worst kind." Sarah crossed her arms, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. A man like this, wealthy enough to own a large ranch, could bring danger right to her doorstep. Red Rock was a small community. Word of his presence would spread quickly, and that could mean trouble. "You should be in a doctor's care," she said cautiously, "or at least at the sheriff's office." John shook his head stubbornly. "I need to be on the trail. Every hour I'm laid up, they get farther away. I can't let them disappear into the hills." He swung one leg off the table he had been resting on, attempting to push himself upright. The effort drained the color from his face, and he sagged back slightly. Sarah moved quickly, placing her firm hands on his good shoulder to steady him. You're in no shape to ride." From the floor, Emily piped up with surprising clarity for her age. "You can't chase bad men if you can't even sit up." John glanced down at the little girl, blinking in surprise as she held out a small piece of dry bread from her plate. "Here. Mama says food makes you strong." His eyes softened in gratitude, and for a moment some of the tension eased from his face. He accepted the bread slowly, savoring it as if it were a feast. Sarah let the silence linger before she spoke again. "You'll stay here until you're steady enough to stand without falling over. A few days at least." John's voice was laced with reluctance, but the edge was gone. "I don't like being grounded," he admitted. "On one condition: no one in town hears about me. Not the sheriff, not the storekeeper, no one." Sarah studied him, curiosity sharpening her tone. "Why?" "If they think I'm still breathing, they'll come looking to finish the job," he explained quietly. "I'd rather they believe their work is done." After a long moment, Sarah nodded firmly. "Fine, you'll recover here. But understand, my daughter and I keep to ourselves. I won't have trouble spilling over into our lives." John met her gaze steadily, respect shining through his weariness. "I don't plan to bring you trouble, Mrs. Collins," she supplied. "Mrs. Collins," he repeated, inclining his head in acknowledgement. "Then it's a deal." Emily smiled brightly at the exchange, clearly pleased with her role in keeping the stranger from riding off half dead. Sarah, however, kept her thoughts guarded, wondering what kind of man could lose everything in a canyon and still carry such quiet resolve in his eyes. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Sarah had not expected. Each morning she would find John awake early, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee Emily had proudly poured for him, half full of grounds because she had not yet mastered the art. He bore it without complaint, thanking her every time. His shoulder healed slowly under Sarah's careful hands. She boiled water, changed the bandages, and checked the wound for signs of fever. "You've done this before," he remarked one evening as she tied the last strip of clean cloth in place. "I had to," she answered quietly. "When my husband was alive, the nearest doctor was a day's ride. You learn what you must." By the fourth day, he insisted on doing more than sitting at the table. "You have a fence that looks like it's holding itself together out of stubbornness," he said, nodding toward the back pasture. Sarah hesitated, but before long she saw him out there with a hammer in hand, moving more carefully than he probably wanted her to notice. Emily tagged along, holding nails for him and chatting about Buttercup's antics. He also took to giving Emily short lessons on riding. "The trick is to make her trust you," he told her, as the little pony snorted under the saddle. "Not by pulling hard on the reins, but by letting her know you're steady." Emily beamed, repeating his words back as if they were gospel. One chilly afternoon, Sarah hitched the wagon and drove into Red Rock for supplies. At the Mercantile, while measuring out flour, she overheard two ranch hands speaking in low tones near the stove. "Word is, that gang's still around," one said. "Cleaning up loose ends. Don't want any witnesses walking into the sheriff's office." Sarah kept her face still, but her heart picked up its pace. She finished her purchases quickly and headed home, the sound of their words following her all the way down the frozen road. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah found a freshly sharpened knife resting just inside the back door. It was hers. She recognized the handle, but the blade gleamed in the lamplight. John was sitting by the fire, running a whetstone across his own belt knife. He did not look up when she entered. She knew without asking that he had sharpened hers, and that he had placed it there deliberately. "You planning on butchering a hog in the kitchen?" she asked lightly. "Just thought it should be ready," he said, still working the stone along the edge. She did not press him. The gesture spoke for itself. He had heard the same whispers, or guessed the danger, and rather than talk about it, he had prepared her to face it. Later, as she banked the fire for the night, Sarah found herself watching him from across the room. His strength was plain enough, but it was this quiet watchfulness, the way he guarded without fanfare, that unsettled something in her. It had been a long time since anyone had thought of her safety before their own. It was late in the afternoon when Sarah heard the sharp clatter of hooves in the yard. She stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, just in time to see Buttercup, trotting in from the west pasture, the direction of the canyon. The little pony's flanks were streaked with mud, and the saddle was skewed, leather straps marked by long, fresh scratches. John was at her side before she could even call for him. His gaze swept over the pony, and his expression tightened. "That is not from grazing in the meadow," he said, running a hand over the saddle's gouged edge. "These are fresh, and this mud, canyon mud. I know it anywhere." Sarah frowned. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," he replied, low and certain, "that someone has been near your land today. And if Buttercup came from the canyon in this shape, it was not just a passerby. The gang that took my horses, they may be moving through here again." Without another word, he grabbed his coat and hat. "I am going to see for myself." "I am coming with you," Sarah said quickly. "You are not," he countered. "If they are still close, I am not putting you and Emily in their path." A small voice interrupted them from the doorway. "I want to come," Emily said, hugging the porch post. Sarah shook her head. "No, sweetheart. Stay here." They compromised, taking Emily inside and telling her to keep the door locked until they returned. Then Sarah and John led Buttercup toward the canyon, following the hoofprints in the damp earth. The sun was slipping low, shadows stretching across the rocky ground. When they reached the mouth of the canyon, John slowed, scanning the ground. "Here," he murmured, crouching beside a patch of disturbed soil. The prints were deep, the shape unmistakable to an experienced rancher. 4 horses. Shod like the ones that ran off with my herd, same spacing, same size. Sarah crouched beside him, her pulse quickening. "So it is them?" "I would stake my life on it," he said grimly. For a long moment he stared down the canyon trail, his jaw set. "If I ride tonight, I might catch them before they get too far ahead." "You are not strong enough yet," Sarah said firmly. "You can barely lift a fence post without wincing. What happens if you face them and you are not ready?" "I cannot wait forever," he replied. "Every day I sit here is another day they get farther away." Emily's voice startled them both. She had followed quietly to the barn and was now standing just behind them, her eyes wide. "If you get hurt again," she said softly, "Mama will be sad." John turned, the hard edge in his face easing. "Emily," she looked down at her boots. "You said you would teach me to ride better. You cannot do that if you go away and get hurt." For a moment, no one spoke. Then John drew a slow breath, straightened, and gave a single nod. "All right," he said. "I will wait, but I am not wasting the time." Over the next days he quietly gathered supplies, a coil of rope, a box of cartridges, dried food, and a bedroll. He spent the mornings helping Sarah with chores, the afternoons walking the fence line, scanning the horizon. Sarah pretended not to notice the preparations, but she felt the difference in the air, like a storm building far off, too distant to hear but close enough to sense. And John stayed, for now, his watchful presence as steady as the mountains beyond the canyon. The rain had been falling since dusk, steady and cold, turning the yard into a patchwork of mud and slick grass. Sarah had just finished banking the fire when she heard it, the dull, uneven thud of hooves, too many for a single rider. Then came the coarse laughter, drifting through the night air like the smell of smoke before a blaze. Emily stirred in her sleep as Sarah crossed the room and peered through the curtain. Shapes moved against the darkness. 3, maybe 4 men on horseback, lantern light flashing off wet slickers and the glint of steel. The door burst open before she could move, slamming against the wall. A heavy-set man stepped inside, water dripping from the brim of his hat. His eyes roved over the room before settling on her. "Evenin', ma'am," he drawled. "We'll be taking whatever food you've got, and you're going to tell us where you're keeping that fella Dawson." Sarah's heart kicked hard in her chest. "I don't know anyone by that name." One of the others, tall, lean, with a scar curling around his mouth, grabbed her by the arm. "You'll remember quick enough if we give you reason." Before she could speak, the leader's head jerked toward the sound of hooves pounding up fast from the shadows. Out of the dark and rain, a horse lunged forward, John Dawson in the saddle, soaked to the bone, his hat pulled low, eyes locked on the man holding Sarah. He did not shout. He did not warn. In one fluid motion, he swung down, caught the leader's arm, and hauled him clean out of the saddle. The man hit the ground with a grunt, and before he could reach for his weapon, John had twisted it from his hand and shoved him, face first, into the mud. Chaos erupted. The scar-mouthed man turned toward Emily's bedroom door, but Sarah was already moving. Her fingers closed around the knife John had sharpened days earlier and left on the shelf by the hearth. She slashed at the rope binding her wrists, then lunged forward, cutting the cord the tall man was fumbling with to block her way. "Emily," she called, "come here now." The little girl darted into her arms, and Sarah pulled her toward the kitchen door, shoving it open into the rain. Behind them, the fight was quick and brutal, John moving like a man who had been ready for this night all along. The clatter of hooves came again, this time from the east. A voice shouted, "Sheriff's here!" Lanterns bobbed through the rain, and within moments 2 deputies had the remaining men disarmed and in irons. The sheriff, a wiry man with a gray mustache, tipped his hat toward John. "Got your message this afternoon?" "Good timing." John nodded, breath still heavy but steady. Knew they'd come back for what they missed. Sarah held Emily close, her pulse still pounding. She looked at John, mud on his face, rain streaming from his hair, and realized he had not just been waiting for the gang. He had been planning for them, making sure the sheriff was within reach. The knife was sharp, the ground in his favor. When the last of the horses clattered away under the deputy's watch, John walked over to her. "You're both safe," he said quietly. Sarah met his gaze, the truth settling deep in her chest. "Because you thought ahead." He gave a faint smile. "Because I promised." The days that followed the attack were filled with hard work and slow recovery, as the storm and ensuing chaos had left deep marks on Sarah's farm. The fences, once standing firm, now sagged and twisted from broken posts. The heavy gates were torn from their hinges, clanging hollowly in the wind. The once solid earth had turned into thick, sticky mud, where the horses had stampeded, leaving deep grooves that made every step a struggle. Yet John was everywhere at once, his hands steady and sure despite the ache that lingered in his injured shoulder. Together he and Sarah worked side by side, tightening wire, hammering nails into splintered posts, and reinforcing the gates with a strength Sarah had not expected so soon after his ordeal. His determination was unwavering, a silent promise that the ranch would stand strong again. Emily watched from the porch with wide eyes, clutching a small hammer she had claimed as her own. She copied John's movements with a seriousness beyond her years, her little fingers gripping the tool as she tapped at pieces of wood under Sarah's watchful eye. Each afternoon, John found time to teach Emily how to properly care for Buttercup, guiding her small hands to stroke the pony's soft coat and showing her how to sit confidently in the saddle. "Gentle but firm," he would tell her with a smile, patiently explaining how trust and patience were the keys to a good rider. Emily's laughter and eager questions brought warmth to the long days, weaving a new thread of life into the fabric of the farm. One evening, as the sky darkened early and rain pattered softly on the tin roof, Emily was already tucked into bed, her breath deep and even beneath the patchwork quilt Sarah had sewn from scraps over the years. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackling fire that cast flickering shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. Sarah and John sat close to the hearth, the soft glow illuminating their faces as the weight of the day settled around them. Breaking the silence, John's voice was low and thoughtful. "I came here broken," he said, his eyes reflecting the orange flames, ready to keep riding alone, to face whatever came next without anyone by my side. He paused, searching the fire as if looking for the right words. "But you and Emily, you've given me something I didn't even know I was missing." Sarah turned toward him, her eyes searching his with a tenderness she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. "I stopped believing I could trust a man," she confessed softly, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "Not after what happened with my husband. I thought I was done hoping for anything different." Her gaze dropped for a moment, heavy with the memories she carried alone. John reached out slowly, bridging the space between them. His hand brushed gently against hers, warm and steady, as comforting as the firelight dancing around them. "You don't have to carry that alone anymore," he said quietly, the sincerity in his voice wrapping around her like a protective blanket. Their eyes met, and in that moment the walls Sarah had built around her heart began to crumble, not as barriers, but as foundations for something new, something stronger. The heat of the fire inside the cabin seemed to ignite a warmth within her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Without a word, John leaned in, his breath mingling softly with hers. The roughness of his beard grazed her cheek as their faces drew closer, a tender connection sparking between them. Sarah's hand rose instinctively to his neck, fingers curling into the worn leather of his coat, grounding herself in the quiet intimacy of the moment. Their lips met in a gentle, hesitant touch, the first question in a silent conversation, the first answer to long unspoken hopes. The flickering flames caught the sparkle in their eyes, highlighting the unspoken promises and fragile beginnings of trust. When they finally parted, Sarah rested her forehead against John's, the world outside shrinking until all that remained was the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of two hearts learning to heal and to believe again. From that night forward, the line between stranger and savior blurred into something deeper and more profound. No longer bound merely by gratitude or circumstance, they began to build a family, growing stronger with each passing day. Together they crafted a home not just of wood and stone, but of shared hopes, renewed dreams, and the kind of love born in the quiet moments after a storm. The morning sun spilled golden light over the Dawson Ranch, its warm rays stretching long and lazy across the rolling fields and weathered barns. The gentle breeze carried the fresh scent of pine and earth, rustling through the tall grasses and whispering promises of new beginnings. Sarah stood on the worn wooden porch, her eyes tracing the familiar contours of the land she had called home for years. But today, beneath that familiar sky, the landscape seemed different, full of hope, brimming with possibilities she had not dared to imagine before. John stood quietly beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Without a word, his hand found hers, fingers wrapping gently around hers, conveying a certainty and comfort that needed no spoken promise. "I want you both to come live with me," John said softly, his voice steady and sure, like the earth beneath their feet. "This ranch is bigger than I can manage alone. Sarah, I want you to have full say over the house, your decisions, your space. Emily will have room to run and grow, and Buttercup will be right where he belongs, right here with us." Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears, tears that held the weight of relief, joy, and gratitude all at once. She lowered her gaze to see Emily bouncing on the balls of her feet nearby, her wild curls tossing in the morning breeze, a bright smile lighting up her small face. At the sight of Buttercup tethered close by, Emily's excitement burst forth like sunshine itself. "We're going to live with Mr. John!" Emily shouted with pure delight, her little arms wrapping tightly around the pony's neck. Buttercup nickered softly in response, as if understanding every word, sharing in the happiness of this momentous day. John's smile softened as he watched the fearless little girl who had changed everything with her boundless trust and unshakable spirit. "Welcome to the family," he said, his voice gentle and full of meaning. Days turned into weeks, and the trio settled into a rhythm that felt both new and perfectly natural. The house hummed with laughter and lively conversation. The kitchen was often filled with the aroma of fresh bread and hearty stews, the result of shared meals and shared efforts. Sarah's garden, once sparse and struggling, now flourished under her careful hands, and Emily's eager help, bursting with vegetables and flowers that brightened the homestead. The ranch itself thrived under the combined care and expertise of John and Sarah. Fences repaired, pastures tended, and cattle managed with a renewed vigor that promised a prosperous future. The shadows of past hardships and dangers, once looming so large, now felt distant and softened by the strength of their unity and the love growing quietly between them. One evening, as the sun dipped low toward the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of amber, rose, and lavender, the three rode out together. Buttercup led the way, trotting with spirited energy ahead of them. Sarah felt the familiar weight of John's hand gently slipping into hers, his fingers curling around hers in a silent promise. A promise of partnership, protection, and shared dreams. They rode along a ridge that overlooked the valley below, the air crisp and scented with pine needles and fresh earth. Emily's joyful laughter floated back to them as she encouraged Buttercup to quicken her pace, her small voice filled with delight and the freedom only a child could know. John glanced over at Sarah, the last rays of the setting sun catching the depth in his eyes. No words were spoken, but the love they had found in each other spoke louder than any declaration could. It was a love born not just from kindness, but from courage and the unexpected turns of fate. A love that had transformed strangers into family, hardship into hope. Together, beneath the vast and endless Wyoming sky, they rode toward a future bright with promise. The bonds they had forged, tempered by trials and strengthened through trust, stood firm, stronger than any storm that might come their way, unshakable as the mountains themselves. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey through the rugged beauty and unexpected love of the Old West. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it with others who appreciate tales of hope, courage, and family. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more inspiring stories that capture the spirit of the frontier and the power of human connection. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Until next time, keep your hearts open and your spirits wild.